Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the 129th episode of Stories of Service, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. And I am the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And sorry for the little bit of a delay this morning. The time zones between England and the US always are a little bit challenging, but thank you for your patience. Today, I have another amazing guest and somebody who I have admired for many years from afar. Tim Parlatore, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to come on. This has been a long episode in the making, and one of my favorite subjects to talk about is the law, specifically within military criminal justice, but the pursuit of justice above all else. And I first saw Tim's work when he represented retired Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher. And when Eddie Gallagher was accused of 10 UCMJ offenses, I was so impressed by your professionalism and the way that you and the entire legal team handled that defense. And then later, as you represented Stuart Scheller, who, as we know, spoke out on the Afghanistan withdrawal. Again, it was a very much an adherence to the law and an adherence to the facts of the case, despite any of the biases that we saw. So you are the founding and managing partner of the Parlatore Law Group, which is a nationally recognized and you are a nationally recognized attorney who practices criminal defense and civil litigation. And you've avoided pigeonholing yourself into representing only certain types of clients in favor of maintaining an interesting and eclectic portfolio of cases. You rose to prominence through your representations of the former police commissioner of New York City, the man who parachuted from the World Trade Center, and organized crime figures. They're already well known. Tim skyrocketed to worldwide recognition through this defense of Eddie Gallagher, which really was one of the most significant war crimes in the history of the U.S. Navy. Since then, you have gone on to represent very high-ranking current and former government officials, including state and federal legislators, a former state governor, a mayor, a four-star admiral, as well as even a former U.S. president. And what I thought was very interesting, and we'll discuss this even more, is that although you're known to represent these high political figures, it's not like the spotlight is something you seek. And for many of your clients, you do handle these cases quietly without any headlines to protect your clients' images and reputations. And you've been recognized by several organizations. You're a regular commentator on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. And we're going to start off the conversation with my favorite topic, which is that you are a former naval officer, a surface warfare officer who served in Operation Enduring Freedom and on board the USS Normandy, and later the commanding officer of a reserve military police unit, Naval Security Forces La Maddalena. I may have pronounced that a little incorrectly. Okay. Thank you. And a member of the U.S. Navy Marksmanship Team. Welcome again, Tim.
Thank you.
So first off, I always like to ask my guests, where were you born and raised, and what inspired you to choose a life in the military service?
So I grew up, was born and grew up in New Jersey. And, it was one of those things where it kind of called to me, throughout my high school time. I was constantly stopping by the tables with all the recruiters there. And, I thought that enlisting in the Marine Corps would be a pretty good idea. My parents disagreed. And one of my classmates there, her father was a Naval Academy graduate and a former surface warfare officer. And so, she introduced me to him, and he, kind of told me some things about, maybe you don't want to just go to boot camp. Maybe you want to, consider the Naval Academy. I then met with a somewhat distant cousin of mine, who was at the time the combat systems officer on USS Normandy, and he gave me a tour of the ship, and kind of solidified the idea that going to the Naval Academy and going that route made the most sense. And I really fell in love with the place, and just put all my efforts into going to the Naval Academy and joining the Navy.
Why did you choose surface? Was it because of the people that you met before going into the academy that you chose surface warfare?
Actually, no. So the first 3 years that I was at the academy, my goal was actually to go into the Marine Corps. I thought that I wanted to be a Marine infantry officer.
Mhm.
And there were a couple of events that happened, at the end of my junior year, which kind of changed my trajectory. Um, one of which was that I spent the summer in Quantico training with the Marines, and through that experience, I think I kind of discovered that I could be a decent Marine Corps infantry officer, but I wouldn't be the best.
Mhm.
I'd be
Yep.
mediocre.
Right.
Um, and at the same time, something happened where my best friend at the academy was brought up on charges, a practical joke gone wrong, and he was facing expulsion,
Mhm.
separation from the academy. And he and I sat down and kind of went through everything. And, I was very good at regulations. And so I kind of, as an untrained midshipman, figured out, okay, it's not this, what they're charging you with. It doesn't fit all the elements of that, but it definitely is this thing over here. And so, we built the argument. Then he and I went up to go see the commandant's SJ, staff judge advocate, and kind of, argue the case. At the time, the commandant was Admiral Locklear, and
Hmm.
and then the jag kind of looked at us like, why are you two here? And my friend says, honestly, I don't know how to explain this, so I need him to explain what this is. And so I laid out the whole case. He looked at it and said, okay, that makes sense to me. I'll go make a recommendation to the admiral. Sure enough, the next day we were informed that the charges had been dropped down to my suggested lesser offense, which brought it from commandant level down to battalion officer level, so no longer a separation level offense. He went in and pleaded guilty. He did like 100 marching tours where you march around in a square with a rifle for an hour, 100 times. And today, well, actually next month, he's taking command of the USS Zumwalt.
Wow. Do you think that was an early sign that you knew that you were absolutely the other thing
Oh,
is that you eventually go down a path of law, so was
that
that
was
sort of
it.
Mhm.
That was the sign to me of, those two events kind of came together, and I realized, okay, I like the idea of being a Marine infantry officer, but I'm going to be just mediocre at that. This is something I have a very great talent for. It's something I really enjoy doing. It's something where I can really help people and save their careers, their lives, their freedoms. And so it really developed that passion in me. And so I kind of at that point turned my focus to, okay, how do I get into the Navy JAG Corps?
Mhm.
Which is not something you can do out of the Naval Academy. And
Right.
so surface warfare appeared to be, kind of the fastest path to get a lateral transfer. And so that's when I decided, okay, let me go here instead. Um, and to be clear, I loved being a surface warfare officer. Okay, I love that job.
Mhm.
I miss it every single day of my life today. But I did make that decision because I thought it was a great stepping stone towards where I really wanted to be, which was in a Navy courtroom.
But it's also
So
the heart and soul of the military,
yeah,
and I did the same thing, Tim. I joined SWO community so that I could lat transfer to PAO, and my first ship was USS Russell. I had an amazing experience with now, Admiral Brad Cooper, who just went, I think, to CENTCOM to be the deputy, and I'm so grateful that I started off as a surface warfare officer, and I still feel like I'm a SWO at
yeah,
heart because it's the lifeblood of the military. It is what I mean of the Navy. It's what the Navy exists to do is drive warships.
sure.
A lot of other missions as well, but I think that was such a wonderful way for you to get started and to have those roots, and then to do that lat transfer to the JAG community, which you later did.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you just got out and became a lawyer. Okay.
That's the next part of the story.
All right.
I applied and I was
Mhm.
rejected.
Really?
So I applied for a lateral transfer. I was rejected, and at that point, they were at a stage where this is around 2005, where they were decommissioning all of the old ships. So all the frigates and Spruance class destroyers are disappearing at a much faster
Mhm.
rate than new DDGs are being put out. And yet at the same time, the same number of ensigns are being put out every year. And so we were an overmanned community.
Yep.
And so they were offering people to get out. And so
Mhm.
I kind of looked at it and said, okay, I tried. The Navy JAG Corps doesn't want me that way. Let me get out and go to law school on my own and try and come back. And so that's what I did. I got out. I went to Brooklyn Law School. And I then, while in law school, I made multiple applications to come back on active duty as a JAG officer.
Hmm.
All of those were rejected as well.
Wow, Tim. I didn't know this part about your past. And I bet that just made you even that more determined to want to go to want it.
It does. It's the first military case I tried, which was an administrative hearing. It's kind of funny because I went against this prosecutor who was a reservist JAG commander who had interviewed me on, I think, my second or third, go around, and
Mhm.
I mopped the floor with her. I totally destroyed her in this case. And at the end of it, she kind of looked at me and she's shaking her head and she's saying, I interviewed you. Why didn't you end up going into the JAG Corps? And I just looked at her and I said, I have no idea, ma'am. I figured you'd know better than I do. Y'all didn't want me.
Right, and a lot of times the people who are doing some of the interviews aren't necessarily the same people who are determining the board, of
Of
course, but
course.
I I had a very different path in that I had a very good commanding officer, and we were overmanned too. We had tons of ensigns just everywhere on our destroyer, and I was able to go to Pac Fleet and go TAD while I was stationed in Hawaii, and from there I became the community relations director for the ships that would transition in and out the carriers to do the DVM, what we call the distinguished visitor embarks.
Mhm.
And so from there, I didn't get my first board, but that was because they said the SWO community needed too many people, and then the second board I was picked up. But I hear stories like yours all the time where people are 100% qualified, but it's just either the timing or the people on the board or whatever don't get it. So you try to become a Navy JAG, you don't get it. You're in Brooklyn, you're in New York, right? So then you say, okay, I'm going to go be a civilian lawyer. That's
Correct.
the next step. I
Correct.
see. And so you started building your career
Yeah.
outside of
And
military.
look, in retrospect, I'm happy with every decision, including the decisions of those boards, because the reality is that as a young lawyer, growing up as a lawyer in Brooklyn and in New York City was a much better environment. I learned so much more about how to try a case than they teach up in Newport at Navy Justice School. While I was in law school, I worked for a guy named Eddie Hayes, who was a very well-known guy. In fact, the book Bonfire of the Vanities was written about him. I then spent the next several years working for all these guys, being mentored by basically all of the guys who tried the John Gotti trials back in the late 80s.
Hmm.
And they taught me how to try cases, really at the highest level. And I did a lot of great cases. I was doing these big organized crime, cases in New York City, Gambino family, Genovese family, Bonanno, all those, kind of cases. And I learned so much through that experience. And, so that you carry it forward and, there's no way that I would have ever been able to gain, the skills that I have, but for the way that I did it. So, so I don't have any regrets about it. I'm glad. I think I'm a much better lawyer for it.
Right, and now you're able to go back into some of these cases with military people, but having all this experience about the Justice Department on the outside world, and I would argue that a lot of our military civilian lawyers that do the kind of work that you do don't have that same background.
Oh, none of them do. I say this with all due respect to the Navy JAG Corps, but there are a lot of institutional problems, in my opinion, one of the biggest ones is just structural. It's the only legal organization in the federal government, the JAG Corps generally, not just the Navy, but Army, Air Force as well, that it has no lateral hires. Okay. Everybody there starts at the bottom and moves their way up.
Mm-hmm.
You've never had an attorney general who started at the Department of Justice and just moved up that ladder. Every single one of them has gone somewhere else and gained some more experience and some more learning. And so what you have is you have this tiny pyramid where if you get in on the ground level and you move up within this tiny pyramid, you get to the levels of senior leadership. And there's some good people there. Don't get me wrong, but they don't get any new blood in
Right.
at any time. And there's nobody in this organization that has ever really tried a case outside of a military courtroom. Not a single one of them, all the way up to the admiral. None of them have ever really stood in a U.S. district courthouse and picked a jury. And so they don't have that experience. They don't have, the education really. And so as this tiny community continues to teach itself,
Right.
they lose a lot of opportunities for learning. And so that's one of the reasons why, when I go into these cases, they all went to the same school, Navy Justice School. They're all trying the case exactly the same way. They're all using the same, phrases, the same transitions and everything. I sit there and I laugh watching them as they're cross-examining, and every single one of them, they ask a series of questions and they say, okay, I want to switch gears and talk about this. And I'm sitting there saying, why are you all telegraphing to the witness where we're going next and using this rote formula? And then I go up and go completely in a different direction. And, none of them are really expecting any of the stuff that I'm doing because it's a completely different playbook.
Well, I can tell you when I started following the case with Eddie Gallagher, I saw things during that trial and during that case that I'd never seen within military justice. I saw all of this demand for transparency that had never been exposed within our system. And I remember thinking how refreshing this is to see what this could be like if we were able to be more transparent about how we do things. But there aren't, like you say, lawyers that are familiar with some of these things that we need to become better at. And that's one of the questions that I know we discussed before the call was, what is the role of the press? Because during Eddie Gallagher's case, that was a huge part of that case. Now, it won't be for every case, but how do you decide as a lawyer when to not when to say use, but when to work with the press versus when, like you said, this is a case we're going to try to resolve at the lowest level?
Well, so first of all, I very rarely involve the press in a case. They come of their own volition. When I showed up at Eddie Gallagher's case, I wasn't the first lawyer on that case. I took it over from a couple of other lawyers, and the press was already there. And so under the ethical rules, a lawyer is not allowed to make extrajudicial statements, meaning out-of-court statements, that has a substantial likelihood of prejudicing the proceedings. So for me to call the press and say, hey, everybody, come watch this case, and I'm going to make all these statements about it, is totally improper. However, and this was the part that I think a lot of the JAGs didn't fully understand. Now, in that case, there were leaks from the prosecution side where they brought the press in. They were, feeding them a lot of false information, and trying to drive this whole, narrative. And then when I came in, I started doing, I didn't organize it, but every day when I walked out of court, they would have a bank of microphones. They would say, Tim, would you come out and answer questions? I said, sure. So it's like a daily press conference at the end of every, day of court. And a lot of the JAGs didn't understand. They're like, Tim, the rule says you're not allowed to make extrajudicial statements. Well, how are you getting away with this? I said, guys, you got to keep reading the rule. What's the next sentence? The very next sentence is, however, a lawyer may make any extrajudicial statements that they believe reasonably necessary to counter negative publicity that was not caused by the lawyer. Because you guys leaked all this information and created this whole press circus. Therefore, under the second sentence of the rule, I have free reign to go out there and counter it. And that's what I did. I am not a person who believes in ever no commenting a case. The press are going to run. If the press are on a case, they're going to run an article. Okay, I can't get them to stop it. And so, especially if my guy's been arrested. And so for me to say no comment only indicates that I have nothing helpful to say.
Mm-hmm.
In every case, I will engage with the press. I will talk to them. I will answer their questions to the best of my ability and the ethical guidelines to help them to shape the story to more closely match the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did in that case. That's what I do in all cases. So I have very good relationships, with the press as a result.
How did you transition from working the civilian cases back at the DOJ and elsewhere to transitioning to taking the Gallagher case? Or was that your first military case, or did you just start to slowly transition into more military cases? How did that come about?
So at the time, I was in New York City, and so there's not a lot of military in New York City.
No.
I did some stuff. I did, I did some things over at the Reserve Center, which I found to be, fun and something, to give back. I did a court martial for a New York-based recruiter who was accused of falsifying medical documentation to be able to get recruits in. And so I had done some of that type of stuff. But then when the Gallagher case came up, and I was invited to participate, that was really my opportunity to go in deep on it. And it was an opportunity that I think for me was just perfectly suited because I had spent so much time in the district courts and in the state courts of New York City, kind of, honing my skills. And then to come back over here and to do that case. And, when we walked into the room, I'm the only lawyer there that didn't go to Navy Justice School. I'm also the only lawyer in the room that's warfare qualified. And that was a huge difference because there were a lot of things that happened in that trial that the lawyers didn't appreciate. Our jury panel in that case, we had one senior enlisted SEAL. We had the foreman or the president of the jury, which was a former, recent DDG CO, S.O.S, and the rest were pretty much senior enlisted infantry Marines. So we had a phenomenal jury panel, like a jury that really did reflect the jury of your peers. And so things would happen in there. I remember this one instance in particular where one of the witnesses we presented, which was the guy attached to the platoon who was like the crypto intel type guy. And he had been on all the operations. He had seen all the things. He knew the intelligence behind it. And so he was able to very clearly speak to whether things were appropriate, whether, they were shooting at civilians and that kind of stuff. And when he was describing his job in an unclassified way, he basically said, I have headset on. And so I have, one radio net in this year, one radio net in this year. And then I also have my little screen here with a chat window. And that's how I'm getting all the information. So that's how I know the bad guys are over there. These guys over here are not bad guys. So I don't shoot at them. And the prosecutor gets up and starts cross-examining him. And he he first of all, he had his back to the jury and he's looking at the witness, which I never do. I go the other way. And he starts cross-examining him on, so you're listening to one radio in this year and another in this year, and you have a chat window? How could you possibly know anything that's going on? And since he has his back to the jury, he has no idea that they're all sitting behind him laughing at him. Because, especially the SWO, who's sitting there saying, oh, only 2 radios.
Day-to-day life.
That's great. And I looked around the room. Eddie and I looked around the room. We realized every lawyer in the room thinks he's making a great point, and every person that's actually deployed, in a combat scenario, thinks that he's making a fool of himself.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the most unfortunate parts, I think, about a lot of our communities. I mean, I can say the same thing about the public affairs community. I've been mostly operational my whole career, but we have public affairs officers who've gone to the Pentagon and then they never leave the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And they really lose sight of what happens at the fleet level because they just don't have that same knowledge anymore. And it's one of the reasons why I always wanted the jobs like the one I have today, where I'm at where the action is happening, where the people are deploying, where we're doing the operations, because I think that where the rubber meets the road is the most exciting part of being in the service or being in any craft, really. So it's interesting you say that. What do you think would improve the military JAG community? Like you say, maybe transferring people later on in their careers and allowing people to come in at the 03, 04 pay grade. Would that be something that you'd suggest?
I think that would help, but so I have a lot of ideas on this. First, I think that you need to redo training and bring in people from the outside to help with the training. And you can do that any number of ways, whether you redo, just retool the curriculum in Navy Justice School. But what I would do is I would suggest increasing the reservist side of things.
Yep.
Bring in more federal prosecutors as reservists. Bring in more defense attorneys, people like me, as reservists. And then match them up with the active duty trial lawyers. And then imagine, if you will, some lieutenant trying a case with somebody like me as the second seat.
It'd be so powerful.
To help mentor them through the process, like in the actual, case. So I think that you could do something like that. There are other things that I would suggest. One of the things is I would take all the judges out of uniform, because the way that the detailing system works, you have people moving back and forth constantly. You're a prosecutor today, you'll be a defense attorney tomorrow. The judge is judge today, but tomorrow he'll be commanding officer of the defense attorneys. And so throughout, you have a baked-in conflict where all of these attorneys are realizing that the person that I'm going against or the person I'm appearing in front of tomorrow could be writing my fit rep.
Right.
And that, to me, is a conflict. If I appear in front of a district court judge and I have an associate who's even thinking about applying to the U.S. Attorney's Office, we have to disclose that as a potential conflict.
Right.
That he or she may, take certain actions because of what they want to do for their next job, as opposed to what's the best interest of clients right now. So I would consider even splitting out prosecution and defense into separate communities. I would take the judges out of uniform entirely, and civilianize it, make it, retired JAGs who can come back for, as appointments as, military, judges. I would consider maybe even consolidating it across the services, and instead of having, Navy courtroom, an Air Force courtroom, and an Army courtroom, just make general military district courts. So that you have, some level of consistency and professionalism across the board. And also I would consider, what they're doing right now. A lot of these are reforms that they bring up. Yeah. I love it when people try to, bring up, some of Senator Gillibrand's, some of her initiatives, and they say, "What do you think of this?" And they're expecting me to say, "Oh, it's a terrible idea." And I always surprise them by saying, it's a good start. Doesn't
Mhm.
go far enough.
Are you talking about taking the prosecutions for sexual assault and domestic violence and
Yeah.
things like that out
Yep.
of the hands of commanding officers and putting those into a special prosecutor's office?
Right. So they've now established the Office of the Special Trial Counsel.
Mhm.
And so, in each area, you now have, you go into Norfolk in the building there, and you have the Defense Service Office, you have the Regional Legal Service Office, which is the old prosecutor's office. You have the Office of the Special Trial Counsel. So you now have two different prosecutors' office in the same building. But you didn't get a special defense attorney side. And even though you have these two separate prosecutors' offices, they're staffed by the same people.
Right.
It's just somebody who was transferred. Just move your desk from downstairs to upstairs. You've gone from being a regular prosecutor to a special prosecutor, but they haven't changed the training really.
Right. It's not like they're specially trained to take on those kinds of cases. But do you think that it might solve some of the conflict of interest issues for those particular charges? So people who
Yeah,
are accused of those things now know that it's not just their commanding officer who's going to determine whether or not this case
right.
moves forward. So I think that's a start, as you said.
Absolutely. I think it's a great start. I think that you have somebody, and look, the guy that they chose for the lead special trial counsel, Admiral Stevens, is a guy I got a lot of respect for. I think he's a great choice for that job. And so he's a guy who can really make decisions and exercise discretion as to, is this a case we really should try? Because that's another problem that I see. And
Mhm.
it's more of it's an institutional mindset where so many of these JAGs are thinking, what can we do? Well, we
Mhm.
can charge them with this. We can do this, and therefore we will. And they skip over the whole section of, that the U.S. Attorney's Office and the District Attorney's offices all do, which is, should we?
Should we? Mhm.
Just because you can charge somebody with that, should you? Prosecutorial discretion is something that I deal with every single day with DOJ and with all these other prosecutors' offices. And then you walk into a military, court, and you talk about prosecutorial discretion. And yes, our discretion is we're just going to do everything. If we can do it, we will.
Right. And that eats up a lot of time and a lot of resources, and sometimes it's for cases that may not hold
Right.
enough evidence to be
It's
able to proceed forward.
when Senator Gillibrand sits there and says we need special prosecutors because the conviction rate of sexual assaults is too low. The reason why the conviction rate is so low is not because the prosecutors aren't trained. It's because they're prosecuting every single case, whether it has evidence or not.
Right.
There is no, triage there where procedurally it's there, but in reality, if they can do it, they do it.
Mhm. And I had a defense attorney on my show, not maybe about a year ago, who even said to me that those cases, the sexual assault type cases, are the hardest to prosecute
Yeah.
because of the fact that the evidence a lot of times is mostly hearsay, or it's people's testimony at the time. A lot of times there's no hard evidence of those issues, and it really comes down to if the person is believable, if the person's willing to testify, all these factors which make these cases so difficult. But I feel like there isn't anyone that wants to have that conversation and to say those things.
I don't mind having the conversation.
Well, that's why we're having it,
Yeah.
because and I think that's unfortunate that that's the cold hard reality. But you talk to any attorney who's done these cases, and they'll tell you that that's the part that makes these cases so difficult and why a lot of these cases don't get prosecuted is because it is very hard to prove these types of cases.
It is. It's hard to prove, and it's also something that they talk about how it's the most frequently underreported crime. It also happens to be the most frequently falsely reported crime, and that's
Interesting.
that's a problem. And it's difficult to prosecute, but it's also difficult to defend.
Mhm.
And when I have done those types of cases, it's one of those things where you can't just attack the evidence. If a woman comes in and tells this story, I can sit there and poke holes and say, oh, well, you said it was on the third floor, but really it was on the second floor. You said it was 2:00. It was really 3:00. I can pull all of these elements out, and I can show that, that certain aspects of her story can't possibly be true. But at the end of the trial, the prosecutor's going to get up and he's going to say, okay, yeah, he poked a couple of holes in her story, but you have to remember, why would she lie? Why would she come in here and make these accusations if something didn't happen to her? Why would she put herself through this embarrassment and what Mr. Parlatore just did to her on the stand? Why would she put herself through all that if something didn't happen to her? And oftentimes juries will sit there and say, something happened to this woman. Maybe she got some details off because of the trauma of it, but yeah, I think he really did do it. And so as a defense attorney, even though I have no burden of proof, I don't have to prove these particular elements. In order to be successful in those types of cases, you have to go beyond simply taking the story apart and go to why.
Yeah, why would they
Right.
falsely accuse?
Exactly. And that's the question you have to
And
ask.
that's a hard one to answer. It is.
And sometimes, look, I haven't tried one of these in the military, but I've tried them on the outside. And sometimes the answer is they were out drinking, and in the morning she sobered up and realized that she had, made a mistake and cheated on her boyfriend. And it was easier to say that she was raped than to admit that she had cheated. I've seen those cases. And when you present that to the jury so that they can understand, okay, there's a reason why she told this story. And that's when the jury will say, okay, I understand. And quite frankly, it's that principle also applied to Eddie Gallagher's case. And I kind of told him from the beginning, I'm like, as murder cases go, this one's kind of like a rape case because you're being accused by members of your platoon. And so we could take apart the story, but ultimately the jury's going to sit there and say, why are members of the platoon turning against their own chief if something didn't happen? And so we needed to be able to explain to the jury why. What was the witness's motivation to lie? Not just that they lied, but what is their motivation to lie so that they could understand and be able to acquit.
When you go back to that case, I mean, what do you think was their motivation to lie?
So that was a very unique case in a lot of ways. It was a very unique platoon that he had. Eddie was on his 8th combat deployment. He came into this platoon, and the way the SEAL platoons work is, when you graduate and you first go to your first platoon, you usually stay through that platoon through 3 deployments. And so the most senior people under him were first classes who were on their 3rd deployment, all with the same platoon. The first deployment, they went to Afghanistan, and they were training the police force there. So they weren't in combat. The second deployment, they were in Guam. There's no combat in Guam. The third deployment, they're in the Battle of Mosul. And so the first time that these guys have ever been shot at is under Eddie. Entire platoon. And so it was a very bizarre platoon to have this long after 9/11, where you have no combat veterans whatsoever. And some of them were definitely scared, because the way that the mission was, it was not a classic SEAL mission. They were going out during the day, never at night, and they were not moving too far. They were advising, assisting, and accompanying the Iraqis, and the Battle of Mosul was being taken yards at a time, and sometimes they would have to go to the same roof multiple days in a row, and they're all sitting there saying, well, wait a minute. They taught me in sniper school that you never go the same hide twice, and Eddie keeps telling us to go the same hide day after day after day. This is dangerous. He's being dangerous. And they made these complaints that they didn't like his tactics at the time. And, the troop commander and the troop senior enlisted said, no, those are legitimate tactics. This is just a different mission than you're used to. Exposing yourself to enemy fire, to draw the fire, to figure out where to return fire, things like that.
Right.
And I think a lot of them were, not ready for that. They didn't like it. They started making other complaints. Oh, he stole stuff from our barracks. And it escalated because none of these complaints were actually working to get what they wanted, which was for him to be removed. And
they weren't being addressed. So they were just incrementally trying to find a way. And then I think I know Eddie's wife called it like a sewing circle, but it was kind of like
she didn't. They did.
Oh, really?
They did.
They called
the group text.
Oh.
The group WhatsApp text was actually called the sewing circle.
That's just crazy to me.
Yeah.
And I mean, it really shows you the power of groupthink and what happens when one person or a leader in those groups, because if I recall the case correctly, there were a couple people that sort of spearheaded this coordinated campaign to try to take him down.
It was a small group, really. It was about 4 people that were really heavily involved in this. It was not the whole platoon, like the media said, that the prosecutor leaked to them. But ultimately, and here's the actual story of what happened that day, in Mosul, which hasn't really been told. Like, all the breadcrumbs are out there, but nobody's really, I've told it a few times, but nobody's really told it in this concise fashion as I'm about to explain it to you. But what happened is they were assigned to the Iraqi Emergency Response Division, which is a unit that had previously been blacklisted because they had committed war crimes. And guess what? They were still committing war crimes. And so every night, just about, they would take prisoners and they would torture them. And they, rape them with broomsticks, and they kill them in a room right next to where the SEALs are sleeping. So every night they would listen to these screams. And what happened on this particular day is they located, the ISIS commander in this battle. They called in an airstrike. An Apache helicopter came in, put a few Hellfire missiles into the building, leveled the building, killed the ISIS commander, killed several ISIS bad guys, except for one. The courier lived. He ran out of the building. He was shot by the Iraqis, and then they put him on a stretcher. He was actually interviewed by Iraqi TV, an Iraqi TV reporter, clearly appearing on death's door. They toss him on the hood of a Humvee. They drive him around. They finally bring him back to the compound. When they did that, Eddie, walks up, and the SEALs, hear that they're bringing an ISIS prisoner in. Eddie walks up, and this is in the video, where he just goes to the Iraqi general. He says, "This guy ISIS?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "All right, I got him." And so Eddie clears the Iraqis away from them. And they didn't, for whatever reason, they didn't do a translation at the time of what they were saying. But, they were getting ready to torture him. And the Iraqi general said, no, not in front of the Americans. So Eddie clears him out, and he does an assessment on him. And he realizes very quickly, this guy's not going to make it. Okay. Mm-hmm. He has blast lung. He has, internal bleeding. He has massive injuries. And he and the other members of the platoon, including the witnesses against him, agreed, we don't want to hear him scream. So they decided to perform medical treatment on him until he died. They knew he was going to die. So they performed medical treatments on him, all medically indicated. But, and this is the part that, look, the prosecutors knew this. I knew this. Nobody wanted to touch it because it was so difficult at the time. But the reality is, everything they did was intended by the book to stabilize somebody with these types of injuries for transport to a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
The treatment that they provided only works if you have a helicopter coming. There's no helicopter coming. There's no helicopters that would be authorized for a low-level ISIS terrorist in these circumstances. So they performed these treatments on him, which, by the way, happens every single day in ERs across the country right here for training purposes. You know, doctors do this in ERs every single day, where they get the junior doctors and they'll do these things on people that they know are going to die.
They know they don't have any hope, but they know that it can provide some training value to the people who. Now,
Right.
you said though that it was also to prevent him from screaming and just,
Prevent
dying
him from being tortured.
from being okay, got it.
They hit him with morphine. So they knocked him out with painkillers, and they did these treatments on him until he died. That was the plan. So Eddie, at one point, they started taking rocket fire, so he left and went up to the top of the building to deal with that. And Corey Scott, the medic, was there left with the body.
Right.
And he realized that they'd stabilized him, and he was breathing through the tube. And so before anybody came back, Corey Scott put his thumb over the tube. So,
and Eddie knew this going into the trial.
He didn't know about the thumb over the tube.
He didn't.
He didn't know about the thumb over the tube. When Eddie came back, he came back down. Excuse me. He looked at him. He checked his pulse and everything. He flicked his eyelids, and then he pulled out his knife and he poked him in the side. He didn't stab him. Didn't penetrate, but it's a dead check. He did these things to try and promote some form of response to just verify that he was in fact dead. So, excuse me. Ultimately, when these individuals wanted to make the false claims against Eddie, they had an incident that was clear in everybody's mind. They took a kernel of truth and they changed the facts slightly.
Right.
Turn it into a crime. So that's the true story of what happened there on that day. It's not something that we brought out during the trial because I didn't need to. I didn't need to prove what had actually happened. They did. All I had to prove was that the government's version was not true and that stabbing was not the cause of death and that there was no evidence of a stabbing. And there wasn't. So I didn't need to go down this route. The government knew, I believe, about this. They chose not to go down this route because obviously this would have, totally destroyed their ability to charge him,
right,
with murder. But that's what that case is really about.
I just think it's fascinating that they were willing to let somebody go to jail for possibly the rest of their life or for many, many years over something that didn't play out the way they knew that it had played out.
You know what happens is, and this is true in a lot of cases, when people make false accusations, they don't necessarily think about the second and third order effects of how far is this going to go. And all of a sudden, when the train starts rolling down the mountain, they don't know how to get off. Is the only way to get off is to admit, hey, I lied to NCIS. I gave false statements to law enforcement. I committed a felony. Okay, he didn't commit a felony. I did.
Right.
Nobody's going to say that.
No.
One of the guys actually visited Eddie in the brig and told him, apologized to him and said, we never thought that it would come to this.
They probably just wanted to see that their boss got censored in some way. They probably wanted to see that he got what he deserved because they were traumatized.
Correct.
And they wanted somebody to pay for that.
Correct.
And yeah.
And at the same time, that's from the witness's perspective. From the command's perspective, I understand their point of view too. I mean, from the admiral's perspective, Admiral Green and I don't see eye to eye on much, but I understand his perspective because he believed, and he's been vocal about this, that at the time, after 2 decades of war, that there was a lack of discipline, a breakdown in discipline, and he thought this was a great opportunity. You can take this case, take a very popular, well-liked SEAL, former Sailor of the Year, put him in jail for life. And then that is the deterrent effect to help reinstill good order and discipline into the SEAL teams. And I believe that that's, really what they were trying to do. And the problem from the command's perspective is they believed NCIS. They went forward with this, plan to instill good order and discipline, and they skipped over the necessary step of let's make sure the guy actually is guilty before we do this.
Right.
And then, much like witnesses, as things start to fall apart, what senior officer is willing to admit, hey, I made a mistake?
Well, they know their entire career is going to be on the line if they do that. And oh, by the way, not just their career, but any future prospects after the military of gaining any kind of reputational credibility to get that next step in their careers as well, which is part of the reason why, and I wanted to transition to this, is that I do think that there is some very fundamental problems within our military justice system when it comes to due process because of that issue.
Yeah.
And because there isn't this willingness to admit fault or admit when things don't go correctly. And even with command investigations. So if we just take it down a notch from the criminal level and what happened with Eddie down to the administrative level, I know there are a lot of people who don't feel that the command investigative process gives them due process. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that issue.
The Department of Defense does a lot of things extraordinarily well. Chief among them, waging war.
Absolutely.
One thing the Department of Defense is absolutely horrific at is conducting investigations.
Yes.
It is one of the weak points of the department, and understandably so. If you take a step back, I have dealt with investigators from so many different jurisdictions across the country, state, federal, local, and so I've seen what good investigators are. In the military, you have, so you've got multiple levels. You've got the command investigators, which are not really investigators. They're just
no, they have zero training. Right. They go to a legal school for maybe 3 weeks, and then they're called investigators. Or some of them are just appointed. They're the investigating officers. They just happen to be the person that gets that collateral duty.
Right. And some of those to be fair, some of those investigations I look at and they're very well done.
They are.
Sometimes
I would agree with that too.
Who says, okay, I'm taking this thing real seriously. I'm going to run it to ground. And they do a great job. Sometimes you read them and you just say, support and defend the Constitution, but don't read it. But so you have the command investigators, you have that level of training problem. At the top, you have like NCIS and those guys. But here's the thing. Do you know how you get hired to work at NCIS?
No, I do not.
You go on usajobs.gov, you upload your resume, and you check all the boxes of the federal agencies you want to apply to. Now, You want to be a federal agent? You want to carry a badge and a gun and be a Fed? You're going to go on. You're going to check all these boxes: FBI, DEA, ATF, HSI, NCIS. You only get hired when all the three-letter agencies reject you.
Yeah, that's not
And
very
so
encouraging.
NCIS agents are, and look, I'll say this to their face, they're mostly the people that couldn't make it in any of the other agencies. Yes, they go to the same training facility, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. But NCIS, in my experience, has a pretty horrific culture. Great at making TV shows, terrible at actually conducting investigations.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they should spend more of their time watching their TV show than what they're actually doing. But they're very much in this mindset of if I have this investigation, I have to find something. I have to find I have to get the guy. And a lot of that goes back to statistics of how many cases did you have and how many arrests did you have and all that kind of stuff. So NCIS is again, there's exceptions with any one of these.
Absolutely.
I have a case right now where I'm actually working with the NCIS agent who's so far done a great job. But a lot of these guys are just,
But it's not them. It's what we're talking about, Tim, is the system and the structural checks and balances that are within these systems that don't get a person that has more training or skills.
The guy who investigated Eddie's case, Joe Warpensky, had been an NCIS agent for like 2 years. How he got assigned to the case, I have no idea. The way that he investigated that case was just so completely amateur. I had, as my investigator, I brought Bernie Carrick, the former police commissioner of the NYPD. And if somebody wasn't facing life in jail, it would have been a humorous experience to watch him watch the interrogation videos, because he's just sitting there banging his head on the floor saying, I could take a third grade detective from any precinct in the city and they would do better than this. So NCIS, they don't do very good investigation. Then in the middle, you have the IG, which, yes, they're professional investigators who, aren't at the level of carrying a gun.
Yeah. I've done a lot of shows with about the IG system and the overhaul that's needed. And I think what we're getting at, Tim, is just this lack of resources and manpower and attention and care that needs to be placed on the military justice system. And that goes into another question that I wrote you about. And I don't think this is the only reason, of course. And I do think that, again, I always say I love the Navy. I've been in this business now. Next month, actually, right around this time. In fact, next month to the day, I will have been in the Navy for 28 years. So this is a lifelong advocation for me, and I say it all the time. If I didn't love this organization as much as I do, I wouldn't be the first person to respectfully criticize it when it doesn't do things, in my view, in a way that makes sense and not putting resources towards due process and people and training and time, I believe is breaking trust with the ranks. And I'm curious of your thoughts on that issue. Do you think this issue relates to some of the issues that we have with recruiting and retention?
No question. Absolutely no question. Because when you see some of these cases, as I do, and look, just a quick disclaimer, nobody invites me to any of the good stuff in the Navy anymore. Okay, so I see a lot of stuff that goes on in the Navy, but unfortunately, nobody invites me to the good stuff.
And there is a lot of good stuff. There really is.
That's not true. My friend, my first client from back at the Naval Academy, he invites me to his change of commands and things like that. But aside from that, I only get to see the worst part of it. But here's the thing. When these cases happen and when officers or enlisted are not treated correctly, everybody else sees that. It's a morale issue. It's it's a retention issue. Let me tell you a quick story. So you see this picture above my head of the Super Hornet?
I do, and I'm going to put you on full screen so the audience can see as well.
Okay, so this drawing of the Super Hornet, that was given to me by 4 of my clients. I represented the it was pretty much the whole leadership structure of VFA 106, and it was a situation where a junior unqualified instructor pilot had weaponized the IG system to protect himself. And he filed a whole bunch of IG complaints. And then they received reports that he was secretly teaching students his method of landing on an aircraft carrier, which is not the approved method of landing on an aircraft carrier. And so, they went to the, to Airline JAG and said, "What do we do?" And they said, "Well, start a command investigation of him. Just because he has, protected whistleblower status, you still got to treat him the same." And so they did. And before the investigation even began, there was already an IG investigation of the investigation. So ultimately, the XO of the squadron was removed, and the CO of the squadron did something that I thought was absolutely brilliant. He considered resigning, but his mentor told him, "Do a command climate survey right now." Or in the aviation community, it's a safety survey, but essentially it's a command climate survey. And what he got was a collection of all of these officers saying, watching the XO get relieved is the deciding factor in whether I'm going to re-up.
Wow.
I have decided to leave the Navy because of what I saw here. And that survey was something that was integral for me in doing something that I've never seen anybody do before. I got him reinstated in the squadron.
Wow.
After being relieved. So, that's just one tiny example, but one that was very visible to me because of, all the responses in this command climate survey of what this does to people.
Mm-hmm.
I've represented plenty of guys that, you see this with. Obviously, there's been plenty of enlisted SEALs that watched what happened with Eddie. You gave my bio at the beginning where it talks about 1 4-star admiral. That's an outdated bio. I've actually represented multiple flag officers at this point. And while I'm not going to talk about the specifics of those, the reality is that when people see unfair treatment, it affects morale. Right now, ship's captains, the 05 crowd, is terrified because they see how the IG system has been weaponized.
Yep.
They see good commanding officers being relieved of command and career-ending things for really no justification. I have had the I don't even know what the right word is. The honor, the terrible duty of representing more of my Naval Academy classmates than I care to in relief of command situations, none of whom deserved it.
Mm-hmm.
But every single one of them, it affects people.
Oh, it's a mental health issue too. It destroys people when they're relieved publicly and they're not able to get their side of the story out there. And that's why these conversations, Tim, are so important to have.
But it doesn't just affect them. And obviously I'm primarily focused on my individual client and making sure that they're okay. But the reality is when the CO gets relieved for something that really they shouldn't have been relieved for, you have to expect that the XO and every single department head on that ship no longer intends to scream for command.
That has to be fixed.
You're not just taking out
Mhm.
that one CO. You're removing that entire slate of department heads
You are.
from the command slate.
Mhm.
Yeah, one of my classmates said it best, where he said, at this point, a successful command tour is getting to the end without a substantiated IG.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you I have friends who are COs who tell me the exact same thing that you're talking about right now, because they know they can't trust the system.
Right.
And so until the system changes, then these issues are gonna keep happening, and that's why I'm so adamant that people tell their stories, even
Yep.
if they have to tell their stories once they're retired.
Yep.
They need to tell their stories because people need to know that they're not alone, and
Right.
they're not the only ones who have had this happen to them.
The worst thing for me is, so I see so many of these cases, obviously, and I see so many men and women that they devote their entire adult lives, their youth, their health,
Mhm.
to this thing. And then right at the very end,
Right, right.
right at the very end,
Yeah, they leave on a bad note.
right, and they don't get to leave on their terms, and they're
Mhm.
fighting just to be able to keep what they have earned, their retirement,
Yeah.
and it's heartbreaking to me. And so many of these cases, I sit there and I say, I was having this conversation the other day with somebody. As a Navy, we train the greatest fighter pilots in the world, the greatest ship drivers in the world, the greatest maritime
Oh, yeah.
commandos in the world, submarine drive, all these things. We have phenomenal emergency room physicians that can
Mhm.
patch guys up with bullet wounds and all sorts of IEDs and all these things. All across the board, we have we develop really phenomenal skill sets, but not in investigations or legal.
Yeah.
And
Why?
by that one tiny little piece not being given the same attention to everything that everything else is, it all falls apart. And we have the capability. There's no reason
Mhm.
why we can't. And I say we. Obviously, I'm not in the Navy, but I identify with it quite a bit. There's no reason that the Navy cannot train the best trial lawyers in the
Mhm.
country too.
I Tim,
Guess
I
what?
feel the same way about communicators. Like, I don't understand. I mean, I could go on, and I won't on this conversation, about why we don't do podcasts, why we don't have long form conversations, why aren't admirals speaking authentically to the camera and having the kinds of conversations that I have.
Yeah.
It's just
People are
one of those. I think they're scared, and I think that it's our generation. You and I think, are around the same generation, and I think the people in front of us are just not at that level yet where they understand that this is the new way to communicate. I don't know, but go ahead.
but that's a good point, because authenticity in communication is important. Um, Sometimes my clients are a little bit scared when we go into a courtroom and they look over and they realize, oh my God, Tim doesn't have a script. He doesn't have a list of questions. He didn't write an opening statement.
Right, he's not reading off of a screen.
I have a list of bullet points,
Mhm.
and
I
they'll
do.
watch the prosecutor get up with their binder, and they'll put the binder on the podium, and they'll start reading their opening statement. Never actually look up at the jury.
Mhm.
And the emotion that they're, the fake emotion that they're trying to put into this, it comes off as fake because they're not looking, they're not connecting.
Right, they lost him.
And then I walk up with my little yellow pad that has my bullet points. I put it on the podium. Sometimes, depending on how outrageous the prosecutor was, I'll make fun of them, and I'll kind of grab the podium real quick and stare down and then walk around in front of it. But I just sit there and I look each juror in the eye and I have a conversation with them.
That's what
And
everybody wants. They just wanna be seen. They wanna
when you
be.
do that, when
Mhm.
you do that, when you actually look at your audience and and speak to them, the emotion will match because you're communicating with them. And as you see them sitting there nodding your head like you're doing right now, I know that, I know that what I'm saying is at the right level. And jury box chairs are great because they're on swivels and they have the springs. And so as long as the jury is sitting there, like if they're rocking, if this jury's a rocking, everything's good. And as soon as the chairs stop dead,
Mm-hmm.
all right, let me
Right.
gift. And so, but it's the same thing with public speaking.
It is.
If you're sitting there focused on your prepared script, you're not really connecting with the audience. And I love, when you see a speaker who, instead of having and I know the Navy, at least in my time, the Navy really sucked at the audio equipment. I don't know if they've gotten better at that, but if you can get away from the podium microphone and, whether you have a lavalier mic or a wireless mic, and you step out in front and you actually just look into the crowd, the exact same script comes across totally differently.
And yeah, it's received differently because people know that you're talking to them and you're not just worrying about what you're going to say. And we had somebody comment about the IG system, and I just want to clarify. And they said, the IG system is used to protect unsafe leaders too. And the dysfunction goes both ways. And I would say absolutely. This isn't just about leaders who are targeted. This is also about people who feel that even if they are bullied or they're at a lower level, depending on who the person is that's bullying them, they feel they don't have a voice too. I definitely think it goes both ways.
The one of the biggest problems with the IG system is that in addition to having investigators who frequently don't get it right, there is no due process in there, because the IG gives its finding and then the commander has to take action based on the IG's finding. There is no trial.
No. Nope. And the issue is too, you can't bring in your own witnesses. So if you have an issue, and my camera just went out, so I'll switch over to my other one. But if there is an issue going on, you don't have that option to bring in your own witnesses or to go ahead and
Right.
build your own case. You don't have an option to do that. And then I think that's also part of the issue with the IG system, is that there isn't really that option built into doing that. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I read some of these IG reports, and I think this is so incompetent. This IG investigator wouldn't survive 5 minutes of cross-examination by me.
Mm-hmm.
But the commander is required to accept it and to take some action as a result of it.
Right.
There is no process to really fight it. And there are some ways of doing it, and obviously that's something that I get creative with occasionally, and so that I can get some movement out of it. But here's the other thing, is that even there, if the IG gets something really wrong, there is a way through the Administrative Procedure Act to take it into the U.S. District Court and to challenge it.
Mm-hmm.
But guess what? I can do that, and not a single JAG officer can do it. It's beyond the scope of what they're allowed to do. And so if you don't hire a civilian lawyer, that avenue of appeal is closed.
And that really goes into another question that I had for you, and that is, do you feel that there are things on people's end that they can do before they say, I want to hire a lawyer? Are there self-help options even available to people to fight some of these cases?
Before they say, I want to hire a lawyer?
Right. Because I think that a lot of times,
timeline.
well, a lot of times some people can't even afford it. And that's the other issue, is that they've got an administrative investigation that's bearing down on them. And at the same time, they can't afford. Several thousands and tens of thousands of dollars later, they might not even be successful in their case. And that's another problem with our justice system in the military, is that it really isn't set up to help people that want to help themselves.
That's definitely a problem. I mean, it's something that, So it's something that Eddie and I have talked about a lot. It's something that each of us are attacking in our own way. Uh,
Hmm.
my way of attacking that problem, which goes beyond just military clients, but lawyers are way too expensive. Okay, most lawyers overcharge, and a lot of them overcharge because they're maintaining a big, fancy, and totally useless office.
Right.
And so, my business model, I built it from the ground up to be with no office. So I don't pay rent anywhere. And so 50% of the revenue that goes to a law firm goes immediately to maintaining that office. This is my office in the basement of my house. And if you look up online, you'll see that that I do have a couple of mailboxes. One is a mailbox in a law firm in New York, and
Hmm.
the other one, which is our main mail handling center, is on the fourth floor of my gym over in Arlington, Virginia. And so I go over there in the mornings and I work out, and then I go upstairs and grab the mail. And so as a result of that, our rates are much lower. I try to cut our rates in about half of what we would otherwise charge. That's how I've tried to attack the problem. Eddie went a different way, where he and his family, because of what happened to them, they started a nonprofit organization, the Pipe Hitter Foundation, which specifically exists to raise funds to help people, hire lawyers to be able to defend themselves in these cases. And obviously, there's only a limited number of cases that they can really do that in. But that is the way that they have, decided to try and, level the playing field. There are some nonprofits out there that will do that. There's a program out of a law school down in Texas, where one of the professors there, who's I think a retired Lieutenant Colonel Army JAG, Jeff Adicott, he has a lot of the law students that help him out with these cases, pro bono. So, all those type of things do exist. They're it's not something that everybody necessarily has
Right.
access to, depending on the severity of your case. But certainly, everybody's entitled to, JAG attorney. Although even there, different services have different tripwires as to when you're actually entitled to have an attorney assigned. The Air Force is much better than the Navy. They will give you an attorney much earlier, whereas the Navy basically says, no, you don't get an attorney until you're actually charged.
Hmm.
So, but you can always go to the Defense Service Office to to consult with an attorney to kind of get ahead of it. And the idea of going it alone is never a good idea.
Right.
The whole the Miranda warnings, or 31 Bravo rights in the military. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can will be used against you. You have the right to an attorney. Those mean something. They were written, by the courts for a very specific purpose. When you are questioned, you do have the right to remain silent. You should exercise it.
Right.
You have the right to an attorney. You should exercise it. It is not something that can be held against you that you have exercised those rights. And yet the people that I see that are the absolute worst in the entire country at protecting themselves are police officers and military.
Interesting.
Because we all have this innate faith in the system.
Mm.
Hey, I'm a cop or I'm a military officer.
I'll be protected.
I can just, innocent people don't get arrested. So if I just tell them the truth, then this whole thing will go away. I don't want to get a lawyer because then I'll look guilty.
Right.
And they're the worst at it. And so my message to all of them is you fight for the Constitution, exercise it.
Right.
Exercise those rights. They cannot hold it against you that you want to consult with an attorney. And once you speak to an attorney, if there is a way of talking yourself out of these charges, The attorney can do it for you, but you can't.
Right.
So, yeah, even in the context of if you can't hire a civilian attorney, you have to go with JAG counsel. Do it as early as possible.
I agree. And I think that there are ways that at the lowest level first, you can try certain avenues. What comes to mind for me is when I had a home leak at the house we bought at my last duty station, we utilized a few consultations with lawyers to help us better understand the process of what we would be up against. And through that process, we got to a place where we could ask for a demand letter. And before this was over the course of many, many months, before we decided to do the demand letter, I decided to just research the guy on Facebook, and I found out he was a prior Navy sailor. He was a nuke. He seemed like a nice kid. There was something about the way he looked online, at least, that made me think he could be reasonable. And we reached out to him, and lo and behold, he hired some guy down the street who had no credentials to patch up this leak that was causing our entire, top of our house to flood and basically be caved in.
Mhm.
And he came over to the house. He saw the things for himself. He liked my husband, thought my husband was a straight up guy, and he agreed to give us $10,000 in exchange for not suing him. And my husband was able to fix everything for 5,000 plus supplies. It
Yeah.
was one of the most amazing stories. And even the guy came over for dinner for a cookout one night later on, many months later. And we signed an agreement that I would not go after him. We would not sue
Yeah.
him. And so there are ways sometimes, I do believe, to try to resolve things at the lowest level. And as you said, Tim, that's what you strive to do with your clients. It's not take everything to trial. It's try to figure out what is there a way to win first at that lower level.
That's true. I mean, there are plenty of my cases that you've read about. There are many, many more you haven't read about.
Mhm.
For example, you don't know a single one of the flag officers I've represented because all of those are quiet. And it's some of them may become public later, who knows? But I believe in every single case that before I go into court and just start throwing bombs, that the best way to resolve any dispute is to plan an honorable exit for your opponent, an honorable face-saving exit for your opponent. Plan that exit route and then show it to them and ask them, please, this is the way out. If we do this, then everybody saves face. Nobody has to admit that they screwed up, and everything is fine. And I do that in every single case. And all the cases that you've read about are the cases where the other side has listened to my proposed exit route and said, no.
Mhm.
Okay, it's once you have offered the civilian population the opportunity to leave the area, then you can commence bombing.
Yep.
So
And that's conflict resolution 101
yeah,
is finding that way to win-win and so that both sides walk away feeling empowered. And I think that's part of it as well, is that each side of the equation has to feel that they were heard and
yeah,
that their concerns were addressed.
sure,
Had a recent conflict at work where I think both sides hopefully have now walked away with their concerns addressed, and it was one of the hardest things I've dealt with as a PAO. But it was this is life. I mean, that's how I see a lot of these issues. Is that
yeah.
these are the things we're all going to deal with in life. And I know we've been talking for so long, and I could talk to you forever, but I couldn't. I'd be remiss. I'm going to shift gears one more time, and I do have to ask you about what. And I know we're not going to review the whole case or anything, but what was your experience like, just generally speaking, representing a former president?
That was a unique one. That was a case that he had heard of me, through the Eddie Gallagher case, of course.
Hmm.
And so it was very interesting to me because I got to do things that when you're sitting there in law school and they're going on about certain constitutional principles like, executive privilege and that kind of stuff, and you sit there and say, okay, that's nice, it's interesting, I'm never going to actually deal with that. And here I am in a locked courtroom before the chief judge arguing about executive privilege, in this like secret proceeding. That was kind of cool. It was interesting things, and I've learned more about certain aspects of the law that I never would have had the opportunity to do before. Individually, I got along with the president. I think we had a fairly good relationship, and nothing related to my decision to leave reflected on him individually. It was more about a lot of the other people that were around him that I think prevented me from doing my job the way that I felt needed to be done. When representing anybody that has a campaign, it always presents problems. I am not a politically active person. I represent people on both sides of the aisle. I employ people on both sides of the aisle. I don't want to alienate one side or the other, and I see no value in a business person taking an extreme political position. Unless that's been your business model from the beginning. If you found the coffee company based on the Second Amendment, okay, then that's
a good point.
Totally fine. But if you have another business where you have a broad range of clients, and then you all of a sudden decide, okay, you know what? Now that we're in the era of Trump, I'm going to take half of my client base and just alienate them because I don't like you anymore because we disagree on who should be president. I don't agree with that. And so, as lawyers, we have an ethical obligation to focus on the facts, evidence, and the law, not on the politics. And so that's what I tried to do, with his case and with others. And so, when a campaign gets involved, I try to get away from that. And I've represented people with campaigns before. And for the most part, and this is now my rule going forward, if a client has a campaign, then we need to make things very clear, which is they are responsible for getting him his next job or getting him or her to keep their job. I'm responsible for keeping them out of trouble.
Yeah.
Those are separate things.
They are.
They need to stay out of my way. And that's it.
Yeah.
And I've had that, I was once, I was representing a few people that had campaigns, and they basically said that. They said, Tim, you're here to keep me out of trouble. You guys are here to get me reelected. You guys stay out of his way. Anything you need, give it to him.
Yeah.
And
it's a separate line. It's a complete, and it should be. If for our country to run in the ways that we would like for it to run and for what we want it to stand for, which is the truth and justice, we have to put aside that to pursue in a court of law what makes the most sense. And one thing I always have admired about your interviews is every time you were asked about Trump, and you've been asked in a lot of these interviews, if you Google your name, they'd ask you the most misleading questions. And it's like they just have this opinion. I saw one recently with CBS, and it was just disappointing as I watch it, because it's like, they're not going to rattle you. You're just going to answer the question the way that is the correct way to answer.
Right.
And it's like, well, why did they even have you on in the first place when they're not even really listening to what you have to say?
The reason why they had me on, I have a great relationship with CNN. Okay, I'm on CNN more than any other place.
I saw, yeah.
And the reason why they have me on is because they need to have a diversity of views. And if everybody on there is saying, oh, the walls are closing in, he's definitely going to jail, then they repeat the mistakes that they had with the Bob Mueller investigation. I think that they all ended up with egg on their face at that time. And so now they realize and some of them have been very explicit with me on this, that they need to hear the other side. And the reason why they all like me is because most of the time when they invite somebody from the other side to come in, they instead give campaign talking points about, oh, this is the greatest witch hunt in the history of the world and all this stuff. And I never say the word witch hunt on TV, but for something like this of saying, I don't do that. That's not
Right.
Not me. I'm just going to stick to the facts.
Right.
And it's it's something that I've done in a lot of cases. Eddie's case, was very politically charged, but there it was about how to separate from that. And one of the things we always said, President Trump's involvement was kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand it helped because it got him out of jail, it got him to the point where we could actually prepare the defense, and on the other hand, it took half the media and had them pursuing this whole agenda of Eddie is guilty because Trump supported him. And so and I if you don't mind, just a quick story here as to to inform my philosophy on this. If you go back way to the beginning, John Adams, second president of the United States, tried and won the trial of the British soldiers accused of murder in the Boston Massacre. And that was an extremely politically divisive issue at the time. British soldiers fired on an unarmed crowd and killed, several, citizens of Boston. And people wanted them hanged. And John Adams took on the defense. He was not a loyalist. He was not a fan of the crown, but he was a fan of justice. And when he accepted that assignment, he actually said, they can expect, no prevarication or sophistry from me, which are words that we don't really use these days anymore. And he said, nothing more than facts, evidence, or the law. He tried that case, and he set aside the politics, and he focused on the facts, and he showed how there was adequate provocation, how it did fall under the self-defense, that they were under attack, that they were being pelted by ice and oyster shells and clubs and all of these things, and that the order to fire did not come from the commander. It actually came from the crowd. And ultimately, in closing arguments, he acknowledged the politics of it, but asked the jury to set it aside. And he said, facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be, our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts or evidence. And they voted not guilty. And that trial and the manner in which he tried that case, which, a somewhat Hollywoodized version of it was in the TV show John Adams, but there's a phenomenal book about it that really got into the, really dissected all of it, because it was also the first trial that was ever transcribed in this country, or actually before this country existed, in these colonies. And so that's a trial that I've studied, very deeply, and really guides my philosophy on how to conduct myself as a lawyer, particularly in politically divisive manners.
I love it. I think that this is something that is so refreshing and that we really need in these divisive periods. Before we did we came on this broadcast, I wanted to even just look up where Trump's legal cases were. And it was so hard for me because he's got a number of different cases going on in Georgia. He's got one, I forget the other state, but there's about four
New York, Georgia,
New York.
federal case in DC, and federal case in Florida.
But the headlines are so divisive, and even the way in which the articles are written in our mainstream press, that I finally found a Forbes article with a timeline, and I remember thinking, finally, I can actually read this and sort of understand what the next steps are and where the case stands. But it is very hard in our current media environment for people to get factual information. without a slant. And so this is why we need a legal system that works, because this is one of the few institutions I feel where people can still receive some measure of justice. Because like you said, the process of evidence and due process gives this longer version of events to play out in a way where different evidence can come to light in a more methodical fashion. And if we aren't protective of that, then we're really just going to fall prey to totalitarianism and anarchy. I really believe that, and so the work that you're doing, Tim, is so important and is so vital. And I do believe people like yourself who come into the military and work with our lawyers and kind of force them to level up their game, I believe will have an effect over time of making our justice system better. I do believe that. So
thank you.
You're welcome. With that, I asked you, I know this is probably, I think, one of my longest podcasts that I've done, but it was so worth the time. And I thank you so much for the
trial lawyer talk. We go over time.
Is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you would like to leave our audience with, or anything else that you'd like to add?
I mean, I think you covered, most of it. I think that the big thing for me is I would love more than anything for the Navy and DoD to be able to improve their legal system. And I think it was during the Stuart Scheller case where somebody said, essentially we're fighting against the Marine Corps, and I. And trying to hurt the Marine Corps or something like that. And I said, no, it's not that at all. I'm not fighting against the Marine Corps, and I don't fight against the Navy. I'm not trying to beat up on the Navy. There are certain individuals within the system that don't do the right thing. And there are certain aspects of the institutional, processes which, can cause bad results. But ultimately, I've always believed, even though it looks like I may be fighting against the Navy, quite the opposite.
Right.
I love the Navy.
So do I.
I miss it every single day of my life. And I want it to be the best that it can be. And I want the people there to be taken care of the best that they can. And so, just because you are questioning the status quo, just because you are, pushing back on things, JAGs always get tied up in knots when they accidentally say something to me like, well, that's the way it's done. Oh, really?
Yeah. Why?
Well, guess what?
Well, and I think that the military,
we're not going to do that in this case.
People like us. I mean, I really believe that. I believe that if there aren't people that are willing to respectfully and factually question things, then that is the way things have always been done. And you're going to have a lot of unhappy people. And life is about change and growth. And that's how you get those changes and those growths. So thank you so much for taking your time to come on the show and share your expertise. If people want to find you online, they can. I know they can Google you. Your website comes right up. Is anything additional? Any projects coming down the pike that you want to let people know about?
So I'm. My website, like you said, it's parlatorelawgroup.com. On Instagram, which is kind of my main platform, at Parlatore Law Group for the firm, or my personal one is at Parlatore. Projects I have coming up, I'm actually working on a book right now. It's kind of a unique book because Eddie Gallagher has given me a privilege waiver to actually write a book about that case and to discuss things of really the nuts and bolts of how it happened in a way that, there hasn't really ever been a book by a criminal lawyer on how they tried and won a murder case because of privilege issues. And so, but it was important to Eddie for the story to be told and for people to learn from it. And so that's something that I'm writing right now, to not only help people understand how that case really went down, but also to discuss a lot of the the more intricate details of where I think the fault lines are in the military justice system and how things can be improved. And so, it's intended to be a book that would appeal to a wider audience. I think law students and lawyers can look at it as a good lesson on how to do certain things. Military officers can look at it as a lesson on certain things, and then people that just love reading John Grisham, they can realize
That's probably
we all of a sudden found ourselves in the middle of one of his novels. And so that's kind of the project that I'm working on right now.
Oh, I love it, and I think there needs to be more conversations about that. I'm definitely a law true crime junkie, so I will probably definitely be checking. I will be checking that book out, and I just want to thank you again. I will probably go full screen here in a moment and meet you backstage to say goodbye. But thank you so much for coming on the Stories of Service podcast.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I have an unexpected trip to Stockholm next week, so I'm not sure if I'll be doing a show next week as I thought I was going to, but I will keep you all posted. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. If you're on YouTube, please hit that subscribe, and please take care of yourself. As I always say, take care of each other and have a wonderful evening. Thanks a lot for joining me tonight. Bye-bye.